Ghost and supernatural stories by ghostly echoes retold. The night I started working at Ravensgate Asylum, I could feel something was wrong. The hospital, once a grim relic of World War II, had been abandoned for decades before reopening to meet the growing need for psychiatric care. Its walls had been restored, its halls brightened with new lights, but no amount of renovation could erase the shadows that lingered. Whispers of its past followed every conversation about the place, a sinister history too deeply etched to fade. My shift began uneventfully. The patients were calm, and the atmosphere seemed no different from any other hospital. But as midnight crept in, the air changed. It was subtle at first, a flicker of the overhead lights, the faint sound of whispers that stopped as soon as I turned my head. Patients who had been sedated earlier were suddenly awake, staring into corners of the room, mumbling incoherent phrases. When I asked one woman, Clara, who she was talking to, she only smiled faintly and whispered, "You'll see." The screams started not long after. Clara's voice tore through the ward, drawing me and another nurse to her room. She was thrashing on her bed, clutching her arms. We turned on the lights and my stomach churned. Deep scratches, raw and bleeding, crisscrossed her forearms, too fresh to have been there earlier and too perfect to be self-inflicted. I asked her what happened, but her gaze shifted toward the ceiling, her pupils so wide her irises disappeared. Then she spoke, her voice unnaturally deep and chilling. "It's only the beginning." Before we could react, she was yanked violently from the bed, her body hitting the wall with such force I thought she'd broken bones. We called for help, but by the time others arrived, Clara was unconscious. The scratches on her arms had vanished, leaving no trace. It left us shaken, doubting our own senses. But the unease had only begun to settle in. 2 weeks later, an orderly named Harris heard heavy breathing coming from the basement. That area had once been the hospital's morgue, but it was supposed to be sealed off. Thinking it might be a patient who had wandered down there, Harris grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. He didn't return. A search team was quickly assembled and I joined them. We found Harris lying on the dusty floor halfway down a corridor, his eyes wide with terror. Drag marks trailed through the dust, leading from where he'd fallen to where he lay now, as if something had pulled him against his will. His voice trembled as he repeated the same phrase over and over. "I said no! I said no!" When he finally calmed enough to explain, Harris claimed cold, invisible hands had gripped his ankles and dragged him down the hall. His bruises, dark, finger-shaped marks circling his legs, were undeniable proof. Whatever had touched him wasn't human. A week later, I was serving patients in the dining hall when the lights began to flicker. The air grew colder and an eerie wind swept the room despite the sealed windows. Patients began murmuring, their voices blending into an unsettling hum. Victor, a patient who hadn't spoken in months, started to laugh. It wasn't a human laugh. It seemed to echo unnaturally. Slowly, he rose from his seat, not stood. Rose. His body floated off the ground, his limbs dangling like a puppet on strings. The laughter grew louder, drowning out the sound of trays clattering to the floor as other patients cowered in terror. Victor's eyes rolled back, and his body twisted in ways no human body should. He screamed words in a language none of us could recognize, his voice reverberating through the room. When he finally fell back to the ground, it was with a sickening thud. He was unconscious, but the patients, usually unruly and unpredictable, remained deathly silent. It was as though they knew something we didn't, something that terrified even them. The incidents only grew worse. Staff began quitting, claiming they couldn't handle the nightmares or the strange occurrences in the hospital. Those of us who stayed found ourselves plagued by whispers in the halls, icy drafts that came from nowhere, and the unshakable feeling of being watched. One night, while walking through the ward, I saw it. At the far end of the hall stood a figure, tall, impossibly gaunt, cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly red, and its presence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. It raised a hand, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened as though invisible fingers were closing around it. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. I thought it was the end, but just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving me gasping for air and trembling. The hospital was closed again within 6 months. Officially, the reason given was structural issues, but those of us who had worked there knew the truth. Ravensgate Asylum wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Years later, I came across a report about the hospital's history. During the war, it had been used for secret experiments, not just on psychiatric patients, but on soldiers. The records hinted at rituals, attempts to harness supernatural forces as weapons of war. The experiments had failed, and the soldiers who had participated claimed the rituals had summoned something far worse than they'd imagined. It wasn't just the patients who had died in those halls, it was the very walls themselves that had absorbed the darkness. Ravensgate remains abandoned to this day. Locals claim that on quiet nights, you can still hear laughter echoing through its empty halls, followed by a single blood-curdling scream. If this chilling tale gave you goosebumps, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Thank you for tuning in to Ghostly Echoes. Until next time,